Welcome to the Peace Corner podcast. This series is brought together by GPAC, UNOY, and CSPPS. Each episode will bring to you a different peace builder and their personal story. In this season, we dive into the topic of inclusivity. How do we meaningfully bring this concept beyond tokenism? How can we truly include women and youth in peace building?
Young women and men still suffer from stereotypes, myths, and policy panics that harm their agency and affect realizing their full potential for peace.
The evidence is clear. Development is not sustainable if it is not fair and inclusive.
Our efforts to build and sustain peace need to be democratized to include the communities most affected. Young people are our best chance in succeeding.
In order to break the status quo and make the world a better place, we need gender equality. The fantastic phrase, women's rights are human rights, must become the spine of all our political work.
Welcome to this episode of the Peace Corner podcast. Today we are going to interview Najeebullah Azad, a peace activist from Afghanistan. Today we are going to dive into the topic of youth involvement in the process of peace negotiations in Afghanistan. Welcome, Najeeb.
Thank you, Vesa.
So our first question is, what motivated you to take on a role as a peace builder and human rights advocate?
Well, my life experiences has shaped my ideas about being included in the peace process, and also to support my other young mates in the country to take part in promoting peace and bridging the gap that has existed for a long time between the ethnic tribes in Afghanistan, which has been the main reason of the war in the country. So since my young age, I had to flee the country during the Taliban and go to Pakistan for 9 years. I was a refugee there. And all of my life experiences and my academic experiences have encouraged me to take a more active role in supporting the people who are voiceless or who wants to raise their voice but needs a guide or needs a mentor, and to work together with other youth in my country to promote peace.
How did your experience as a refugee in Pakistan affect your desire to achieve inclusivity in the field of peace building?
Well, my journey to Pakistan has been very influential on me personally in terms of first understanding the conflict. How has this Afghan war been going on for 3 decades now? How does it affect international community, and where does it take roots from? The Islamic madrasas and where the terrorists are getting trained there. And also how young people in Pakistan, young Afghans who are refugees, are passionate about getting back to the country because they are born in Afghanistan, but they had faced tough situations and had to leave the country. So there's a desire in every young Afghan youth outside Afghanistan. I've been in Europe as well, in India, in Pakistan. I've been to several countries, and everywhere I go, even second generation Afghans, they have this desire to get back to their country and contribute, not towards only peace, but to development and based on the capacity that they have earned. And it's very important to mention that my country is one of the youngest countries in the world. More than 65% of the population in Afghanistan is below 25 years old, which means that these 65% is going to be shaping a lot of the institutions in the country and a lot of the grassroots level activities, because the elders are going to be retired or they're going to just let the youth take part. But the only problem now is that the institutions in Afghanistan is very much elder-centric because the warlords who have been involved in the war previously are still in the government. They have a huge power. Their political parties have a huge power, and that's why they are recruiting their own people who are usually not youngsters, but mostly elders who follow their own mentality and ideology. So youth has a voice to make, but until now that situation has not come up in the country, because they have the capacity, but they are not put into the position to work towards a peaceful Afghanistan. And I want to mention as well that Afghanistan just drafted their Afghan national youth policy for the first time. So there was no youth policy before 2014. And that was approved by the cabinet in 2016. But the problem is that Afghanistan is facing insecurity, unstable economy, opium production, and the war on terror. So these kind of significant, important processes are kind of taking the way of the national youth policy implementation, for example. So the government is not much focused on promoting youth empowerment or youth inclusion in this kind of activities, but they are more focused on elections or killing terrorists or fighting poverty.
So what has been the role of youth in the process of peace negotiations in Afghanistan until now?
The role of youth has been very influential in grassroots level, because youth in Afghanistan have taken small initiatives in the local level, not in the national level or regional level, because they don't have that financial capacity to, for example, travel around Asia or to go to the US, and they don't have the funding and the resources. But in the grassroots level, they have been very active in terms of having workshops on peace or campaigns on peace. A group of youth walked from Helmand province in Afghanistan to Kabul, which is around 300 kilometers, and then they walked back towards Herat, which is in the north, far away on the other side of the country. They also continued this campaign during the month of Ramadan, where they fast as well. They don't eat during the day. So they have been very active in the grassroots level, and they discussed on the way with the Taliban, with the Afghans, ordinary Afghans, that they should put down their guns and make peace, which is very important in a sense that Afghans talk with other Afghans about peace, not the Americans coming to talk with the Taliban or Afghans as well, not all of them, but the Afghan Taliban who are in the country, they also want peace. But there are Afghan Taliban from Pakistan as well, and it's a very complicated situation. I'm talking only about the Afghan Taliban. So they talked on the way with ordinary people and terrorists while walking from province to province. And it was very influential. They were in Kabul, they stayed in front of UNAMA, the United Nations office, put a tent there and was sitting there to talk to the UN guys as well. So they took this local approach and came to talk to the international agencies. On the way, they talked to ordinary people, and now they are just walking around the country. So these are just examples of some activities that youth have been involved. Other than that, I have friends myself who are having non-profit organizations and building the capacity of youth to raise their voice in achievement of SDGs. But because Afghanistan is not peaceful, but they focus mostly on the peace building, which is, I think, SDG 17. Peace. So there's a lot going on in the grassroots level, but unfortunately the government has not provided this environment for the youth to come within the peace institutions. And the government itself is not also united. There's a lot of complexity in the government as well, because there's now 3 institutions that work on peace. 3. The first one was created by former President Hamid Karzai in 2010, which was a peace council, High Peace Council. The second one was created in 2017. It's a peace envoy of the president. The third one is just created, which is a Minister of State for Reconciliation Affairs, which means there are 3 organizations working on the same thing, but they are not coordinating well with each other, and they are mostly led by warlords who have brought the country to the current situation. So youth still have to be included in this kind of government institutions.
Mm-hmm. What are international organizations doing to help the youth in Afghanistan in this process?
Well, the international organizations, for example, this Afghan National Youth Policy was created in collaboration with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan and the Ministry of Information and Culture of Afghanistan. But also the international organizations cannot risk to work only with youth, because the warlords have a huge power in the country, and if their power is not taken into consideration in the political game, they are going to go against the United Nations. And going against the United Nations will bring the country back to civil war and all of the bitter history which we have experienced in the past decade. So the United Nations and the international organizations are also taking a very precautionary measure to keep a balance between working with the warlords and the youth. But because the warlords are much more influential than the youth, most of their contributions and activities are with the institutions which are led by the political leaders who have been warlords in the country for many decades. Yeah.
So you as a peace builder, how do you think that youth can be included in a more institutional level in the peace building process in Afghanistan?
Well, the only thing that matters now is capacity and networking. The youth have the capacity, but they need to network better so they can get into the channels within the institutions and get their voice in a higher level. So I think better networking and also capacity building of illiterate youth, because 70% of the country is illiterate. They cannot read and write. And that means that when you can't read and write, then you can't do something big. You need to start working on small projects, raise awareness, go talk to the people, work with the government, work with the international NGOs. So building the capacity of youth and also making youth network with Afghan youth across the country and also youth outside Afghanistan, because what matters in Afghanistan now is how the international community, the United Nations, and the international NGOs approach peace building and changing their perception of their current perception of peace, that they are working with the warlords and they're fighting with gun rather than with pen. So changing this mentality also requires a lot of networking, a lot of connection, which the youth can if they think outside the bubble, you know. They think outside Afghanistan, they interact with government agencies and international organizations outside Afghanistan. And that's what I'm trying to do outside Afghanistan. I had my photo exhibitions in 5 European countries, and I've spoken in many places. And this provides a perfect opportunity for me to raise awareness in the West, how in the past 18 years, the situation has gotten worse rather than going towards the right direction. Afghanistan only had 2 terrorist groups, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in 2001. But after 18 years of war and bloodshed and killing of more than 100,000 Afghan civilians, there are now more than 20 terrorist groups, and the poverty rate has gone high. So the government and the international community need to change their lens towards how they make programs and how they implement programs, and most importantly, how they should include youth in these programs, because youth are the future of the country.
So can you tell us, what is the perception of youth from the general public in Afghanistan? Because in post-conflict situations, youth is seen either as a perpetrator of violence or something that can contribute towards a more positive future.
Well, the current generation of Afghans, like people who are above 50 years old, they do think of youth as a future of the country, but still they limit, because Afghanistan is a very conservative society, they limit youth to certain cultural boundaries that limit youth from raising their voice first, because most places in Afghanistan want the youth to act in a certain way. Like when there is an elder sitting in the room, young people should not talk outside the boundary. They should first let the elders to talk. Like this kind of cultural principles that has existed in the country, they do limit youth, but still, based on my experiences, the Afghans see a huge potential in the current youth, and that's why if you go to Afghan society now, most of them are sending their kids to school just because they want their kid to be something in the future and contribute to the development of the country. But still there are places, for example, that the schools are closed, or conservative societies are not allowing girls to go to school. So this kind of cultural aspect of some Afghan societies are limiting youth. But overall, I believe that Afghans see a huge potential in youth in the long term.
How do you consider that your activism so far has contributed towards a positive change for your country?
Well, my activism has been in different kind of activities that I've been involved. I've been writing blog posts for national newspapers and also international online newspapers. And I've had my photo exhibitions and panel discussions in several European countries, and I've attended many campaigns and talked in many events. So the influence of this kind of activities that I've undertaken is that you first raise awareness about the real situation in Afghanistan. At first, Afghanistan is not a country of war and terrorism. It is a part of the truth. Afghanistan is a beautiful country with rich culture, rich resources, and hospitable people. And nobody will believe this, that my country has more than 3,000 plant species, which is more than the plant species of entire Europe. But you don't get to hear this kind of news from the media, because media is giving that stereotype news about Afghanistan. So first, I raise awareness about the country and how the international community needs to change their approach. So I talked, for example, local stakeholders, ordinary people in the Netherlands or in Spain or in Oslo, in Norway, or anywhere in Europe. And through my online writings, blogging, I interact with international audience. So what matters in this kind of activities is that first you raise awareness, and then you talk to real stakeholders in Europe. For example, you talk to an NGO who is working on peace building initiatives in Afghanistan, or you talk to the UN officials in this kind of events. So these kind of interactions provides an opportunity for me as a young Afghan to contribute towards changing mentality of people, the mentality of international community, most importantly, because it has not brought my country to a peaceful situation now. The situation has got worse. And also to encourage other youth to start small initiatives on giving voice to themselves and to their society, so that their voices can be heard. And also I'm working to network with other Afghan youth to work on long-term projects, bigger projects, where we can have a more broader influence on the current situation in Afghanistan.
Let's move a bit to the topic of gender. What is the current situation of young women in terms of youth civic engagement in Afghanistan?
Well, that's a very important topic. Unfortunately, it's not being taken seriously in my country. Like, women have been oppressed during the Taliban, which everybody knows, but still, though the government gives this statistics that there are more than 25% women in the upper and lower house of the parliament, but there's a huge urban-rural divide in across Afghanistan in terms of women education of women, healthcare of women, women employment, and sexual harassment of women, street harassment. So Afghanistan has still a long path towards achieving gender equality, but we should not also undermine the achievements that have been made since the Taliban, which is not enough at all. But I think Afghan government needs to play a more active role in including women in the institutions, and especially in peace building, because there has been many successful cases of women involvement in bringing peace in Africa, for example, and women is 50% of the society, and they should not be neglected, and their voice should be heard. And in a conservative Afghan society, women has a very powerful role in the family, because woman is responsible for managing the household, doing the work at home, and has a lot of influence on the men in terms of guiding the family. However, outside the house, the situation changes because woman needs to wear hijab and stuff. But inside the family, a woman has a huge influence, and that can be utilized in terms of bringing the Afghan men who are fighting with the government together to achieve a long-term peace. Because you don't see women terrorists in my country, all of them are men, and the power that woman has in a family can play a very influential role in changing the scenario.
And what has been done so far, either by the government or other stakeholders, to include women in the peace process?
Yeah, so the High Peace Council, which was established in 2010, its deputy is an Afghan woman who I know, Habiba Sarabi, and there are some other women as well in the High Peace Council. But the only thing that matters is that all of the other government institutions, especially the presidential palace, they are sort of governed mainly by men, and women does have a voice, but they can't have a say. I mean,
No decision.
they can't decide. They just can share their ideas, and mostly in the hierarchy of government bureaucracy, the men are in the decision-making authority. There has been a lot of work by the international community and the Afghan government in terms of making gender policies and women empowerment policies, but that has not worked. It has only worked in bringing women in the parliament, but that doesn't mean that the women in the parliament are gonna bridge the gender gap in the local level, because women in the parliament is in Kabul, and they can't, for example, travel due to security reasons in the outskirts of the country. So as I mentioned earlier, the urban-rural divide in terms of women empowerment, education of women, and healthcare is a very serious issue, and it has limited a lot of women to get education, get proper healthcare, and to contribute to national level activities, including peace.
And how do you think that young women in Afghanistan could get more involved in activism and participate meaningfully in the peace-building process?
Well, regarding that question, I believe first the Afghan society needs to change their mentality towards women, because in the outskirts of the country, their Afghan societies are very conservative, and they usually want women to take care of internal household activities and not to take part in the social life. But in the urban level, in cities in Afghanistan, women are active, but still they face a lot of insecurities in the sense that they are being harassed in the street. If they go to work in a government organization, even there they get harassed and put pressure mentally on them, like mental pressure. So the women in Afghanistan is facing a lot of pressure from the society, from the government, and the solution for them is to fight back, to together, not alone, because we have this Afghan proverb that if you have one stick in your hand, it breaks, but if you have 10 sticks, you try to break it, you can't do it. So Afghan women need to work together in a village level, in a district level, in the province level, in order to bridge this man-woman gap that exists, and also to convince their families that cultures do change, cultures transform, and for better, and that they need to play a more effective role in earning for the family, in making a positive change in the society, and also in working towards peace.
So, Najeeb, you just told us how the media portrays Afghanistan in a very negative lens.
Mm-hmm.
How would you like for Afghanistan to be viewed by people who don't live there?
Well, first thing that the media should discuss is talking about both sides of the coin, not only portraying the war and terrorism in Afghanistan, but also portraying as I mentioned earlier, our rich culture, our rich plant species, and then our mineral resources. Like, we are one of the richest countries in terms of lithium. So lithium is what you guys use in your technology, in laptop or your phones. And Afghanistan has more lithium than the value of entire fossil fuel industry in the world. But nobody knows that, because people know Afghanistan just because of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and 9/11. And also what media should do is to portray how the West and the international community after 2001 has failed in the country. For 18 years, they have been fighting using taxpayers' money, ordinary Europeans' money, ordinary United States citizens' money, and the war has not ended. They should ask this question from their local politicians, their parliamentarians, and their presidents. And in the current globalized world, something that happens in Afghanistan affects people in Europe. That's why when people vote in the West or in any other country outside Afghanistan, they should also think of what their politicians that they're voting for are going to do for Afghanistan. What's their agenda for Afghanistan? Because for 18 years, the army from the US has been being killed in Afghanistan. Dutch army have had casualties. So every country that has been to Afghanistan, their soldiers have died in war on terror. So we need to be more active in terms of understanding the real situation in the countries that our governments are active, and to vote meaningfully, and to choose politicians by following a common sense, not only following what that politician is going to do for our own personal interests. Because God forbid if something happens in Afghanistan and some European soldiers are killed, that impacts some families here in Europe, because their families live here. or a bomb blast happens in Afghanistan, Afghan diaspora community who are part of the European community now are going to be affected by that. So these are just examples. So media needs to talk about both sides of the coin and to provide more holistic news and information about Afghanistan, and to encourage local journalists in Afghanistan to raise their voice, because local journalists, like there are a lot of newspapers in Afghanistan who talks about the truth in the country, but unfortunately because they're not in contact with New York Times or BBC or CNN, they are their voices are not heard. And one thing that I usually tell my friends in a funny way is that Trump is right about only one thing: fake news. And I don't mean it's fake news. It is news, but it's just giving a false narrative towards the situation. So media needs to provide the truthful narrative towards situations like Afghanistan, and even situations like Europe. From that I mean that the European Parliament just passed a law last year on limiting people to see limited contents in the internet. So when you open a website now on your internet, you get a notification that they want to use your cookies. So they get your cookies in Europe, and then based on those things that you search for, they give you advertisements, which means that a local European who is only busy searching about University of Amsterdam, University of Oxford, or Zara or Albert Heijn will never hear about Afghanistan, because they will just be stuck in this bubble that will only provide news if they go home and turn on the TV and then see some false narrative from the international media. So it's international media needs to provide the truthful news about Afghanistan, and also we in Europe should change our lens towards such policies that the European Parliament, for example, is taking in order to put Europeans in a bubble.
So Najeeb, our last question for you is, how do you think we can go beyond tokenism? And how can we make peace building meaningfully inclusive?
Well, to make peace process more inclusive and go beyond tokenism, we need to include everyone in the society. And from everyone, I mean from a newborn kid to a person who is just in their 90s or 100. From a newborn kid, I mean, because I've lived in Afghanistan and I know how tough the situation for young kids, newborn kids are. Like they are born in a conflict, and they are raised in a conflict, and how they grow up in a family, in the society, whatever they see is either someone going to Kabul, for example, from a village, and on the way they are afraid of the Taliban. For example, my nephew who is in Kabul, he was just like 5 years old, and we were in Kabul, and some people came from our district, and they were like, but on the way there's Taliban, how did you guys come? Like, even young people, young kids like that are trained in a way from their young age that the conflict is going on and the country is not in a good situation. So we need to train the young generation in a way that they are more optimistic about the future of the country. And in terms of inclusion in the institutional level and in the national level, I believe first we need to let women in the decision-making authorities, not only having women in the High Peace Council, for example, just so that they can report to international community that, well, there's gender equality in the High Peace Council. However, the fact is that the woman in the Peace Council does not have any decision-making authority. And also in the international intra-Afghan peace dialogues that are going to happen, and some of them that has already happened in Qatar or in Russia, in Doha, there has been like 30 or 35 men and only 4 or 5 women. And those women like are from all of the women, only one is allowed to speak, and then all of the agenda is run by men. So women inclusion is very important to achieve peace inclusion, and also young people's inclusion, because most of the people who go to these peace talks are warlords and associates of warlords, and also to include other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan has more than 30 ethnic groups, and mostly in the higher government level there's the 3-4 majority ethnic groups who are having the most population in the country. So we need to include every ethnic group in the country, women for sure, and also change our policies in a way that in the long term young people can easily enter institutions in the government and work in a more effective way, rather than being outside the government and not taking the influential role that they can play for development of the country. So we need to include everyone, a newborn kid till an old man or woman.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you in this episode.
Thank you, Vesa.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Peace Corner. Interested in hearing more from us? Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you might be listening.